The NFL is absolutely desperate for wide receivers this time of year. We got free agency coming up. We got the draft coming up. So today what we're going to be doing is breaking down every NFL team's need for a wide receiver. Who needs a number one? Who needs a number two? Who could add some depth to their receiver core? What avenues are they going to go about doing that? Sign some veteran free agents, go make a big splash trade, or dip into the NFL draft pool. We got, 5 to 10 decent wide receiver prospects with a couple at the top that are very enticing. So we're going to go over every NFL team's need for a wide receiver. We did this for the running back position already, if you guys want to check it out. But yeah, we're not going to waste any time here, Danny. Let's get into the first tier of who needs a number one wide receiver.
Yeah, we did pick out 4 teams at the top for needing a true number one wide receiver. We'll talk about the differences in terms of potential investment we can see from all these teams at the wide receiver position this offseason, because as we'll get into, maybe some of the number 2 teams actually are in a better position to add a top end talent. But in terms of just needing a true number one alpha wide receiver, we have the New England Patriots, the Green Bay Packers, the Carolina Panthers, and the Las Vegas Raiders here.
Yeah, and on the screen right now, you guys should see kind of the available wide receivers outside of who's in the draft. Like, we're not including, Ted McMillan and Travis Hunter and Emeka Egbuka and stuff. We'll talk about kind of fits and ideal schemes and that kind of stuff for those players as we go through this. But you guys should be able to see some of the available wide receivers, from the Chris Godwins of the world, who I firmly believe will be back with my Tampa Bay Buccaneers. There's a lot of veteran guys like Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, guys like that. And then maybe some interesting younger names like, Marquise Brown, Elijah Moore, guys like that. And then there are rumored to be guys like DK Metcalf, George Pickens, Brandon Ayuk, Garrett Wilson, Christian Kirk, T. Higgins, who just got franchise tagged, Cooper Kupp. Some of these guys, maybe not all of them, may potentially be on the open market available for a trade. And if a team is wanting to make a splash, as we've heard, for example, for Green Bay, they might be willing to make a splash and go get a number one. That's going to factor into kind of how they want to address their position as well. So let's start with the Patriots, who don't really have a whole lot at wide receiver right now. You got, I would say, your number 3 through 6 receivers types with Demario Douglas, Kendrick Bourne, Jalen Polk, Javon Baker, who actually had a positive report the other day, Kayshon Boutte, who had an interesting little second season. They're all under contract for 2025. Could move on from Kendrick Bourne for some cap savings if they want to, but they also have $129 million in cap room right now, which is the most of the NFL by $30 million. Like, they are by far the richest team in terms of cap space right now. And they do have a number of draft picks. They got the 4th, the 38th, the 69th, and the 77th. So they got 3 or 4 picks basically in the top 75.
The way I describe the Patriots is because, to me, I think they are the clear poster child this offseason of team who needs wide receiver help in a big way. We put needs a number one wide receiver. You can make the case they need a number 1 and a number 2 this offseason. The way I describe the New England Patriots, like when you go out with a couple of your buddies, you're drinking some beers, and you got the one buddy who just drank 5 beers and he's in the corner swiping on Tinder, messaging every available chick in his area. That is the New England Patriots. They have not been mute in their interest for a wide receiver. Every time Devontae Adams gets available, the Patriots are interested. Cooper Kupp's on the trade market. The Patriots are interested. Every available wide receiver I've seen. Deebo Samuel, before he got traded to Washington, the Patriots were interested. Every available wide receiver that I have seen, the Patriots have had interest in some capacity. And like I said, they're like your one drunk buddy that's just messaging every Tinder match that he has.
Yeah, no, they were reportedly very close to trading for Ayuk last offseason. So if Ayuk, who I kind of just talked about, could be available on the open market, is in fact available, it's possible that they're interested in somebody like that, or somebody like Metcalf, some of these guys that are reportedly available on the open market. We both, I think, agree that the best way to address this position would probably be to just select Ted McMillan with the 4th pick in the draft. We think he's worth that pick. It sounds like maybe NFL teams don't think he's worth that pick, and maybe they would want to trade down, or, whatever the case is. But they do also have the 38th pick, the 69th pick, the 77th pick. They did sunk cost fallacy, sink a second rounder into Jalen Polk last year. I'm hoping that's not letting them sway their decision, thinking they're fine at receiver because they drafted a 2nd round pick last year, a 4th round pick last year. Boutte, who they spent a day 3 pick on, Douglas, who they spent a day 3 pick on. You need a dude, and maybe even a dude and a dude 2.0. Like, you need guys at this position. You got a young quarterback who got his ass kicked behind a bad offensive line last year and didn't really have anybody to throw the football to. If you added Ted McMillan at the very least to this offseason receiver core, and maybe a veteran, like maybe Keenan Allen wants to come to New England or whatever. We don't exactly know who they'd
trade
be
for Kupp.
Yeah, somebody like you get a veteran receiver who can play your number 2 role. You get Tet McMillan who can develop into your number 1. Suddenly, you have a good number 3 receiver in Douglas. You have some upside on your bench with Jalen Polk and Javon Baker and Kayshawn Boutte developing into better receivers. If New England Patriots fans are listening to this right now and you guys think you're fine at receiver, I hate to break it to you, you probably have the worst receiver core in the league.
If you guys think you're fine at wide receiver, I'm sure many Pats fans at this point realize how talented Drake May is, how they got to support him with ample wide receiver depth. But I mean, when you're talking about pick 4, pick 38, pick 69, pick 77, all those prime picks, and what I think is a very underrated wide receiver class, on top of the fact, like you said, 129 million in cap space, rumored against every vet wide receiver you could possibly imagine. And like you said, I think this is a double dip scenario. Whether you trade for Cooper Kupp and sign a Tet McMillan, whether you sign a Devontae Adams and maybe wait till round 2 and draft I don't know, like a Jalen Royals type or a Elike Manor. Like, I think they're going to attack this in 2 separate ways this offseason.
Yeah, and I mean, given the draft capital kind of question marks that we've seen for some of these prospects, like Luther Burden, for example, maybe he's available with that 38th overall selection, and you're able to add him to go along with Devontae Adams, who you signed in free agency or whatever. So bottom line is this. If you have any Patriots receivers on your roster and people think they're going to be something because Drake May is a good quarterback, you might want to sell those guys off, although I don't imagine anybody is buying for any significant amount of draft capital or stuff on the open market. They are just a foregone conclusion. They got to add to the receiver position, whether it is via trade, go out and make a big splash, sign a free agent like Devontae Adams, or draft a guy probably significant draft capital wise with the 4th or the 38th pick, maybe those 3rd rounders as well. They got a double dip most likely at this position. So let's move on to the Green Bay Packers, because they are in a weird position where last year, if we did this exercise, we probably would have thrown them in the safe tier, because Doubs, Watson, Reed, Wicks, we were all excited about these players. None of them really leapt into I'm the number 1 of this team. They're all contributing in some form or facet, but we got Doubs and Watson on the last year of their rookie deals, Reed and Wicks 2 years left on theirs.
They're the poster child for wide receiver by committee, but no true alpha. Because again, I like some aspects of their wide receiver core. I think Wicks has some juice. I think Reed has some juice. I think Doubs has proven himself to be that good possession wide receiver. Obviously, very unfortunate with what happened to Christian Watson at the end of the year. Probably not going to be a dependable option in 2025 at this point, unfortunately. They are the poster child. We heard Josh Jacobs call out their wide receiver core, basically implying that they need a number 1 wide receiver. I'm sure management has not overlooked that. And we've heard them as the poster child team to try to trade for a guy like DK Metcalf. And I think DK Metcalf stylistically is the fit for this team.
Yeah, because he's everything you wanted Christian Watson to turn into, right? If you wanted a field stretching wide receiver 1 who can be your number 1 target, you can use Dobbs as a possession receiver. You can mix in, Wicks and Bo Melton in other ways, and Jaden Reed's going to lock down the slot for you. So it would make a lot of sense. I think if there's a big splash trade that happens for a number 1 receiver, whether it's a T. Higgins or a DK Metcalf or a Garrett Wilson or some of these disgruntled wide receivers potentially that want off of their current team and want a big contract and all that stuff, the Packers they're the primo spot for it. They're in a very competitive division. They got a young quarterback on a big contract. They got to get a number 1 guy. And they have picks, like they pick 23rd, they pick 54th, they pick 87th. They could just go into the draft and be like,
they need a number 1.
They need a number 1. Is Emeka Egbuka going to be your number 1 right away? Is Matthew Golden going to be your number 1 right away? Is Luther Burden or whoever else going to be your number 1 right away? I think they might look at their team as a competitive, we could win this thing with a number 1 receiver. So they strike me as more veteran free agent that they add or veteran trade target that they add.
And compared to the other teams in this tier, they are at the most pressure to go and acquire number 1 wide receiver, because the Patriots, the Panthers, the Raiders, expectations this year, they're probably going to be a top 15 overall pick going into the 2026 overall NFL draft. The Green Bay Packers are in the NFC North for a team that views themselves in a competitive window, a team that thinks they can contend 10, 11, 12 plus wins a year. The Bears added 2 interior offensive linemen, also have the 10th overall pick. They're going to be a better team with Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams going into year 2. We saw what the Vikings and the Lions did this year. You have to get aggressive and make a move for a number 1 wide receiver. Otherwise, you will fall behind in that division.
Yeah, and it's possible the Vikings take a step back. The Lions, maybe without their offensive and defensive coordinators from the year before, take a step back. So they might even view this as, hey, this could be our division if we lock down a DK Metcalf or a T. Higgins or a Garrett Wilson as our number 1 receiver, because we have a decent defense. We're a well-coached team. We have a good offensive line, a young quarterback. If we, as we kind of talked about in the running back video, and we're going to probably mention more than once in this video, you knock each of these guys down a peg in terms of what their role and responsibility is to this team. It suddenly looks like a lot better of a receiver core. If you got a true number one in here, Jaden Reed being a complimentary number two as a slot receiver, Romeo Dobbs, Dontavian Wicks working in as possession number threes or whatever, suddenly it's a well-rounded core. And you have a young tight end in Tucker Kraft who had a nice season, of course, a bruising running back in Josh Jacobs.
Yeah, 100%. It would just complete the offense because your number one need. I mean, we've heard teams basically showing in the playoffs down the stretch for this Packers team just disrespecting the ability of that wide receiver core because there's no true number one that's going to make them pay if they go out there and physically press at the line.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you can get this guy, this is a complete team and a complete receiver core at the very least. So the Panthers and Raiders, like you mentioned, kind of not in a super pressing need to get a number one receiver at this point in time. Although I would argue that the Panthers maybe more so than the Raiders because Bryce looked great last year towards the end of the season. You want to continue that momentum. This is a dude that maybe has shown you that his confidence level can be shaken a little bit if he's not playing at a high level. And I like Leggett. I think he can develop into a number one receiver someday, but I don't think you have the luxury of that time to wait for that to happen. Of course, we're massive cokeheads over here. We love Jalen Coker as much as anybody. The problem is, though, you got to make yourself. What happens if you're wrong about those players? What happens if Leggett struggles yet again? What happens if Coker is a UDFA and doesn't really
take
develop
pressure off of them?
Yeah, exactly. Why even worry about what happens if they don't develop? Why not get a number one receiver here? Again, I think they're definitely a candidate to trade for a Garrett Wilson or to trade for a DK Metcalf or to trade for a T. Higgins potentially, or a candidate to take Tetero McMillan, Emeka Egbuka, whoever else in the draft, whether it's with that 8th overall pick, maybe they trade down a few slots. Somebody wants to hop over the Bears or something for Ashton Genty or whatever. It's possible that you're looking at Carolina being, hey, we need to just address a number one receiver in any means necessary.
Hear me out. So the buzz that I've been hearing, again, confirm, deny, whatever the case may be, this is what I've been hearing. Teams are getting lower on Tet McMillan. Teams are also getting higher, obviously, on Matthew Golden after that 4.29. Obviously, he's a 3-level separator. He's the type of guy that I can see the NFL being higher on than the fantasy community. Fantasy community kind of views him as that back-end first, early second round type of talent. I think the NFL might push him up to be a top 12 overall pick and potentially the first wide receiver off the board. And just stylistically, I mean, you got the big bodies of a Coker or a Leggett. You had what you thought Deontay Johnson would have been to this team last year and a guy like Golden. I think that would be the fit, honestly. Again, I personally would take McMillan at 8, but if the shock on draft day was, oh my God, the Panthers just took Matthew Golden at 8th overall, I don't necessarily think that would be as big of a shock as the consensus would view it as.
Yeah, and I mean, if they did take, let's say, McMillan or Egbuka, who are bigger bodied guys, I mean, they ran the ball so well last year. Their offensive line got great push. You have big bodied receivers like Coker, Leggett, and Egbuka or McMillan on the outside. You're going to run, Chuba's going to have another great year. And you also have JT Sanders, who I think this is an exciting young offense, but this is the prototypical, and we already made reference to it. Let's knock everyone down a peg, take the pressure off. I would be very aggressive to go get a number one, whether it's in a draft or in a trade. Those are the two best case scenarios for me. You could sign Chris Godwin in free agency. Of course, Dave Canales has familiarity with him. You could sign Devontae Adams as a stopgap number one or whatever. That would probably work in the short term. And I think that's break glass in case of emergency that you need to do. But I think the best way to solve this problem is go trade for Garrett Wilson, give him a bag, and he's your number one receiver. To me, that Wilson specifically is the one that makes the most sense for this team.
Dude, I would offer 54 plus 110 if it got it done, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't think you'll have to give up 8 for Garrett Wilson or for T. Higgins or for Metcalf or whatever. Maybe if you do give up 8, you get back the first round pick of whatever team that you're, maybe not the Jets because they pick ahead of you, but if you give up 8, you get back Metcalf and you get their pick in the first round, and then you have to send back picks on your side or whatever. That. Get aggressive if I'm Carolina. That's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, and speaking of the Raiders, like you said, their current depth at wide receiver, I don't know what I'm looking at, to be honest. Obviously, Jacoby Myers, he's going to be there, number 2 caliber wide receiver. Fine. Obviously, you don't want him to be your number 1, but he's going to be a starting wide receiver for your team, and you're feeling confident about that. After that, their wide receiver core is Trey Tucker, DJ Turner, actually, who is now not returning to the team because they didn't qualify his RFA. And there are 2 other wide receivers in this core I have never heard of in my life. Ramel Keaton and Jeff Foreman as per their depth chart. Like I said, literally have never heard of those last two names, and they are picking at number 6 overall. I've seen it being reported that they're potentially interested in a wide receiver at that spot. I don't know if they would take one at 6, knowing Pete Carroll's history, but regardless, though, I think you can function with Jacoby Myers as your number 2, but for God's sake, add a true number 1 wide receiver to him, so you're not expecting him to be your number 1.
Yeah, and of course, Brock is de facto your number 1 target, at least as of now. And that actually helps you, because if you were to take, let's say you draft Ted McMillan at 6, or you trade down a few spots and you draft McMillan, Golden, or Igbuka or something like that, you don't actually need them to operate as the number 1 target in your offense right away, because you have Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers, who's a capable veteran. My thought is this, like, if you're going to miss out on quarterback in this class, and maybe you're going to go for the free agent route, sign a Sam Darnold or whatever the case is, why not just like build up the nest in case you do need to address the quarterback position? Like, imagine if you take Ted McMillan at 6, or you trade down and take Ted McMillan. You then have Ted McMillan, Brock Bowers, and Jacoby Myers for your veteran stopgap free agent quarterback. And then into the 2026 draft, maybe you get aggressive and get a quarterback then, and you have this young, dynamic nucleus of young receivers, just like the way that the Falcons, had their offense built up before they got Michael Penix in there.
Can I propose what the Raiders might actually do? And it's so gross to think about, but I can totally see this being a Raiders stamped offseason. They sign Russell Wilson, the reunion with Pete Carroll. They trade for DK Metcalf. And I actually think DK Metcalf stylistically a fit on this team. You have Brock Bowers as your chain mover. You have Jacoby Myers as your chain mover. Now you have DK Metcalf to be that third level speed. Like we already said DK Metcalf to the Packers, but like when you brought up the Raiders, now I'm like, okay, now they got Pete Carroll in, they got Chip Kelly in. Chip Kelly, as we know, knows how to vary his offensive looks. You add a true height, weight, speed wide receiver to that mix. It could be fun.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the Raiders are in a great position to be able to add to this team. The problem for the Raiders is actually how they address quarterback, more so than how they could address receiver. Because let's say they don't draft a receiver at 6 or trade for a big name receiver. They have a 37th, 68th, and 73rd overall pick too. And because you have Bowers, it's not like whatever receiver you bring in has to be your number 1 right away. Like if they could draft Trey Harris or something at 37 or 68 or whatever, and be like, hey, we're going to hope this guy develops into like our number 1 receiver to go along with Brock Bowers, who's our number 1 target.
Yeah, no, I think that would make a ton of sense. Having a guy like Brock Bowers, special overall pass catcher in its own right, even though technically they need a number 1 wide receiver, the benefit of them over the Packers, over the Panthers, over the Patriots is you already have your number 1 target.
Yeah, like think of the 2022 Chiefs when they had Kelsey as their number 1 target and Juju as their number 1 receiver. It's like Trey Harris could do that job, like if you wanted to run that type of offense or whatever. So
that's my comp.
That's like the number 1 receiver tier. Again, there's probably, you can make the argument that guys in this next tier could use like a future number 1 receiver, but it's a current day number 2 receiver kind of thing. So let's talk about this needs a number 2 receiver tier. And there's a pretty large group of teams here, because we got a lot of teams that have one good receiver and nothing else. And there's some teams here that maybe could have a number 2 receiver in-house, but we don't know if they're going to be there still or whatever the case is. So let's start with Danny's team, the Dallas Cowboys, who of all of the teams in this tier, and we kind of rank them as if like, okay, we get a big name guy here. What does it mean for fantasy? And how likely are these teams also to invest in a number 2 receiver? And the Cowboys, it's virtually a foregone conclusion they're going to invest in this position.
Yeah, all the reports, all the media coverage point to the fact that the Cowboys have the 12th and 44th overall picks. And judging from the sounds of it, they are looking to add a wide receiver to this offense in the first 2 rounds. At 12, again, people might say, well, they have bigger needs. They can draft a D tackle, or they can draft, another edge rusher because they met with Micah Williams. The Cowboys have met with some of the top wide receivers in this class, Ted McMillan, Matthew Golden, Emeka Egbuka, that have been made of public note. And they just desperately need more offense or more juice into this offense. Obviously, we know CeeDee Lamb, all world, all talent, 170 plus target wide receiver 1. But man, based off the reports I'm hearing from Ted McMillan, teams are maybe worried about the athletic background because he didn't run his 40, which I think is outrageous, because if you just watch this guy play, he's way more fluid than people are making it sound. People are making it seem like, oh yeah, he's just the stiff outside 6'5" wide receiver. It's like, okay, you must have been saying that about Drake London as well, surely. I don't know what the case is. All I'm going to say is if he's not the wide receiver 1 off the board, obviously we're counting in that instance Travis Hunter cornerback, because if he was a wide receiver and you said, yeah, Travis Hunter went over him, okay, that's one thing. But if like Golden went over him, or Burden went over him, or Egbuka went over him, I think that's a mistake. If this guy were to fall to the 10s at that 12th overall pick, I've heard the report that apparently his range, people are saying is going to be top 10, is actually close to the 12 to 22 range. I believe Mel Kiper went on record and said. So if the Cowboys are at the top of that range at number 12 and they say, well, Ted McMillan's the best player on our board, he could be our X wide receiver. Obviously, we're going to move CeeDee Lamb inside and out. Obviously, we know what he's able to do in the slot. Well, now you have Dak Prescott, who was just the second leading voter in MVP voting 2 years ago, on an offense that I think is going to start to take more shots on the field based off what Schottenheimer has been saying. Obviously, Clayton Adams coming in, supporting that offensive line. I think we're going to start to see a lot more play action shots down the field. You get a guy like Tat McMillan with the ability that he has at the catch point as well as after the catch, man. I think it's just a golden glove fit for him. Obviously, again, that's one wide receiver. It could be Golden. It could be Igbuka. It could be any of these guys. But the one that I'm hearing the most buzz around right now is actually Tat McMillan. And I believe in Dane Brugler's mock, the Athletics mock, actually had him going 12.
Yeah, I think the draft makes the most sense as the avenue in which the Cowboys address this position because, I mean, they like to talk about being all in or whatever. I just don't think it would be very likely that they would trade a big bag for DK Metcalf or whatever. As much as it would make sense for the offense, I think it's more likely that they go, hey, we need a running back and a wide receiver for this offense. Our 12th pick and our 44th overall pick are going to be that position group. Depending on if Genty is there at 12, maybe we'll go wide receiver at 44. Maybe we go wide receiver at 12 because we get our pick of the litter. Nobody's taken a wide receiver yet. And we like the depth of the running back class better. And we know we can get a Judkins or a Caleb Johnson or whatever in the second round. So yeah. I do think they're very, very likely to address the wide receiver position, most likely in the draft. But I don't know. It wouldn't totally shock me if they signed Devontae Adams either.
I mean, I would take it. I think if they were to go to the veteran route, actually the option that I think they would gear towards would probably be like a day 3 type of flip for a guy like Cooper Kupp. Like if they were to go one direction for vet receiver, I actually think Kupp would be the most likely based off the rumors.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know how much you would like this, but I don't even actually think if it costs a 6th round pick to go get Christian Kirk, you could double dip at this position as well. You could take Christian Kirk, play the slot for you or whatever, and then go take a speed 2nd, 3rd round receiver or whatever in the draft to go get Jaden Higgins or something like that. Would probably make some sense for them as well. So they're an interesting team. Again, whatever receiver they do address their number 2 position with is probably going to be pretty fantasy relevant, whether it's a veteran or a rookie. So this is one that we obviously got to monitor. And the same, I think, can be said for the Broncos, because with Courtland Sutton, I think he's one of the probably lower level number 1s around the league. I think he's a good receiver, obviously, but the upside, I think, with the Broncos versus the Cowboys is that you actually potentially get the future number 1 in addition to the current number 2. And that's why I would think this is maybe a nutted landing spot for Emeka Egbuka in the draft, because I think him being a number 2 for year 1 and then a number 1 receiver beyond that is exactly what I want to see out of the prospect Emeka Egbuka. So for me, I would love if Egbuka was the pick at 20 or whatever for them.
I think that's a good way to cite it, because the way I kind of view Egbuka versus McMillan in the context of the Cowboys versus the Broncos is the Broncos need a floor raising wide receiver. You plug Egbuka in, you're going to get your 150 targets from year 1. He's going to play that slot role. I think McMillan actually is even a ceiling raising option for the Cowboys, because CeeDee Lamb's going to be able to do that dirty work, 170 plus targets. Now you're getting a 6'5" guy that can legitimately catch 10, 12 plus touchdowns for a quarterback you're expecting to jump back into MVP talks. So I think both of these spots are the clear top 2 based off what we can expect, depending on who they end up taking.
Yeah, I mean, they also pick in the range that we're hearing wide receivers will go off the board. Like you said, that 12 to kind of 20 range. I would expect this draft class, at least the way that we would value it, that Ted McMillan comes off the board first, and then there's like a cluster of Emeka Egbuka and Matthew Golden probably. It sounds like Burden might slip into the 2nd round. It sounds like Travis Hunter is probably going to be a bit of a divisive topic in terms of what position he plays. I think the over-under, if I had to set it on, how many receivers we see in the 1st round, is like 3.5, depending on what people think of Hunter in terms of what he gets announced as or whatever. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. And that's why the Broncos make a lot of sense to draft a receiver versus like sign one in free agency. But I mean, you got a young quarterback, a guy that took a lot of great steps. There's a possibility that, Sean Payton, for example, played in the NFC South. If Chris Godwin makes it to free agency, he would make a lot of sense for Denver. He kind of would play that Egbuka role. The Broncos also have the 52nd pick in the draft and the 84th pick in the draft. If they don't go with a receiver in the 1st round, they could go with a tight end in the 1st round. They also could even just take a receiver at 52 or whatever. Alec Iomaner's best comparables in the prospect model are like Michael Thomas and Chris Godwin, guys that Sean Payton would be very familiar with. So he would be a good fit for this offense as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would make a ton of sense. Cheaper option, maybe they just say, hey, we'll patchwork at Elijah Moore, and then we'll add another wide receiver that can play inside out. I think that would probably be the way that they patch up this overall core. I think overall, their depth at wide receiver is pretty good. I mean, Mims, Vele, Franklin, Humphrey, if they're your 4 to 6, like a combination of those guys, that's fine. But I truly do think they added 2 more established target earners to this offense. I think that would make this whole thing complete.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's try and speed through a couple more of these here because some of these teams kind of blend together as far as like what they would need. The Chargers and Rams both have young receivers that are established target earners with Lad McConkey and Puka Nacua. The Rams don't yet have Cooper Kupp off the roster, but it sounds like they probably will have Cooper Kupp off the roster. I think for both of these teams, you could see them going in any which direction. They could trade for a receiver and go get an established guy. They could draft a receiver in, with the Chargers, the 22nd pick, the 54th pick, something like that. The Rams also having the 26th and 90th pick. They don't have their second rounder. You could see kind of the way that they address this position going any which way. I would tend to lean towards drafting, given that they're teams that are kind of like resetting, going into a competitive window, but probably not quite there yet.
This is my favorite Devontae Adams spot personally. They have $60 million in cap. Listen, he's probably not going to sign like a 4-year deal. Like if you can get him on a 2-year, $23 to $25 million per year, like I'd be willing to do that on a short term. If you can get him for just 2 years, okay, worst case scenario, maybe he doesn't look like himself. You only have to eat 1 more year after this upcoming year. The Chargers, to me, are the perfect fit for Devontae Adams if he doesn't follow Aaron Rodgers. If he says, you know what, I'm not tied to the hip with Aaron Rodgers. I want to go the place that is best suited for my expertise. They need a number 2 X wide receiver. Now, you can make the case, okay, Lad McConkey versus Devontae Adams. Maybe Devontae Adams at this point is still a better wide receiver. But in the long-term feature of the Chargers, you're depending on Lad McConkey to be your number 1. In terms of the short term, though, you get Devontae Adams. He could play that X role. Lad McConkey, obviously, the inside-out versatility, the 4.39 speed he brings to the table. And now you're relegating QJ into a role that better suits his skill set. He is not a number 2 X wide receiver, but what he can be is a number 3 across the formation yak guy that can play in the slot, that can play that Z role, that doesn't have to face press coverage. Because quite frankly, we've gone through it. His overall separation technique at the line of scrimmage is not where we want to see it from a guy that was a former first-round pick. So even though I think he's got upside, obviously he's got the frame, he's got the size, he's got the speed. If you can get Devontae Adams to take a lot of pressure off of QJ particularly, I think this whole offense would get a ton better.
Yeah, not to mention learning from Adams in practice will help both of those young guys, especially QJ, who needs the most help in that area. I think McConkey can already run routes with the best of them, but QJ specifically would need a lot of help in that area, and Adams would help for that. I agree with you. I think Adams makes so much sense here. Depending on where Rodgers goes, I mean, if he goes to the Giants and Adams is just going to puppy dog his way over to New York, I guess it makes sense, but why would you want to go play for the Giants? You can play with Justin Herbert and, you don't have to play on the MetLife turf or whatever. Like, I don't know. To me, it makes more sense to go to the Chargers. With the Rams, I think it's pretty...
I'll just say one more thing, sorry, on the Chargers. The other thing, let's just say A-Rod and Devontae Adams are tied at the hip and they can't get Devontae Adams on their team, even though I personally think that is the best route to go. If you draft a wide receiver, and hear me out, could we potentially see a little reunion with Mike Williams on a cheap deal, prove-it deal?
No, that wouldn't shock me either. I think if they would just go double dip at wide receiver and grab a veteran like Mike Williams, that would totally make sense to me. And Mike Williams, too, for what it's worth, would probably also have a lot to teach Quentin Johnston about how to get downfield and that kind. Because if that's what QJ's role is going to be in the future, Mike Williams has been doing that for the Chargers for years at this point in time.
Yeah, for sure. But like you said, we'll go on to the Rams. Obviously, the big elephant in the room is the status of Cooper Kupp. We don't have the confirmation on that yet, but based off all the reports I've been hearing, I mean, McVay was asked himself, and the quote from McVay was, "I would never speak in absolutes." Does that sound like a coach that is ecstatic to bring Cooper Kupp back?
No, I don't think so. I think it's probably close to a foregone conclusion that Kupp will be cut if he's not traded. If they can't find a trade partner, he'll probably get cut.
Yeah, and I mean, if that's the case, I actually think this opens up the opportunity for the Rams to add a different type of wide receiver. The reason why I say this is you drafted Jordan Whittington last year. Stylistically has a lot of a comparable skill set to Puka Nacua. If you draft a wide receiver, maybe with some more juice, maybe like a Luther Burden type at 26 potentially, I think we can get very frisky here.
I got a fun one for you. I saw somebody comp this player to Brandon Cooks, and I think Matthew Golden makes a whole lot of sense for them at 26 as well.
Yeah.
I also think there's just a couple of receivers in this class that are just prototype Rams.
Yeah.
Like Alec
Jack
Iomanner and
Mesh.
Jack Besh are both just such Rams receivers that if they do want to just go the route of, yeah, like we're just going to have all of our receivers be the exact same, like they've kind of been with like Cup and Woods and those type of guys. I could see Io Manor and Besh making a lot of sense. Io Manor, I think it's absolutely one of his best landing spots to go to Los Angeles and play the number 2 role there.
Yeah, I think that would make a lot of sense. And we could just move on to the other NFC West team, believe, unless you have anything else on the Rams.
No, we can rip through the Cardinals here. It's pretty clear that they have Harrison and nothing else at wide receiver. I mean, McBride is a great tight end, and he's going to be your number 1 or 2 target, depending on what Harrison does going forward. But you got to get something at wide receiver too. Michael Wilson's running wind sprints out there. Greg Dortch is short king, but he doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. Let's get some speed maybe in this receiver core, at least maybe some versatility with like a Luther Burden. You need something in this receiver core other than what Marvin can give you at number 1 receiver. Get somebody who can take advantage of Harrison getting all the attention, whether it's a speed element or a over the middle versatility element.
And this is why exactly this, when we're going through this exercising, we're seeing how many teams actually need wide receiver help. People are going to shit on this draft class. And, obviously it's not 2024. I get that. But this draft class is very underrated. And I think a lot of these guys are going to go a lot earlier in that, 12 to like 75 range than people expect.
Yeah, there's a couple receivers in this class too that I think give you size, which you already have with Michael Wilson, but I think the Cardinals really care about blocking and running the ball well. And, a Jaden Higgins and Io Manor and Emeka Egbuka, somebody like that who can block really well in addition to being a number 2 complement would make a lot of sense for what the Cardinals want to do. And
Isaiah Bond too.
Isaiah Bond can give you some speed later on if you wanted to go that direction. I also wouldn't rule out, you talked about a reunion for the Chargers. I wouldn't rule out DeAndre Hopkins potentially coming back to Arizona and playing.
I thought you were going to say Marquise Brown.
Yeah, Marquise Brown too. I was thinking DeAndre Hopkins potentially as a UFA comes in, signs a 1 or a 2 year deal here. He didn't get his ring, so he might be still wanting to stay with like a Kansas City type of team who's more in contention, but you never know. I mean, he might have enjoyed his time in Arizona and they could use like Michael Wilson just isn't that good. Like frankly, he's just not that good of a receiver. He deserves to be like a number 3 or a number 4, not a number 2.
Yeah, no, I would agree as well. I mean, he's like a fine utility player, but realistically, if he's the number 2 in your offense, you need wide receiver, which is why they rank where they do. And speaking of needing a wide receiver, we know how good Nico Collins is. And hell, he's one of my favorite players in this league. Tank Dell is going to miss next season. That's almost a foregone conclusion. He had another ACL surgery as we're recording this. I believe an hour ago, he had another cleanup on his ACL. Not a good sign for the future aspect of Tank Dell. Even if you think, okay, by 2026, we're potentially having him in the plans. I honestly think at this point, you have to proceed with the future that you're potentially without Tank Dell. Stephon Diggs, unrestricted free agent. There are reports maybe they would be interested in bringing him back, but there's other reports that apparently Stephon Diggs is actually going to command a market. And if you're Houston, do you really want to pay into a market for Stephon Diggs at this point?
I think he will command a big market. I think, again, would we do this? No, but I think a team like the Raiders or the Panthers or the Patriots or somebody that's like really, like you said, desperate and swiping through their Tinder matches for a dance partner at this position. Like, would the Patriots throw a huge bag at Stephon Diggs? Like, I wouldn't
20
be shocked, man.
per? Would they give him 20 per?
Yeah, it's rough out there for the Texans, in my opinion. I actually think what would be interesting for them is, again, you kind of stow away Tank Dell as a let's hope he gets back on the field okay. And then you play Mechie in the slot this year, and you get a big-bodied outside receiver potentially to go along with Nico. And I like the other one that makes a lot of sense, just stylistically and logically, is Egbuka played with CJ Stroud. He makes a lot of sense in the first round.
I mean, before Egbuka went back to school, him to the Texans was one of our favorite mock spots in last year's class.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Egbuka had his best season with CJ Stroud as well as a true sophomore, and that was the year JSN was down with an injury, didn't really play a whole lot. Marvin obviously doing his thing. Those 3 guys, Harrison, Stroud, and Egbuka, just lit up college football for a calendar season. So I think Egbuka, this has to be one of his best landing spots, just knowing his connection that he has with the quarterback. And also, too, he complements Collins quite well as well.
Yeah, and let me throw out one more option. Another guy that was funny enough, a free agent of another team we talked about earlier on. He's more of a depth guy, probably only going to be a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4. But I just think a guy like Josh Palmer would make a ton of sense on the Texans.
Yeah, you mentioned Marquise for the Cardinals. I actually think Marquise would make some sense for this team as well. I mean, they tried to bring in Deontay Johnson and he didn't work out. He is technically available if they wanted to go get him.
Is he going to play next year?
I don't know, man. I really don't know. I do think if I had to put like Vegas money on who the number 2 receiver is, quote unquote, I actually do think they'll try and bring Diggs back.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it. I don't know if I agree with it, but I mean, hey, like at one point of this offseason, I'm like, okay, where's Diggs going to go? Probably a contender on a cheap deal. But if he actually has a market as an old wide receiver coming off an ACL, good luck to whoever actually hands him out the money.
Yeah, the quarterback and wide receiver position is just that it's a supply and demand thing. You got a guy who was formerly very productive. Like, it's possible he just gets a bag because teams are like, well, what is our other option? Do we draft this like 3rd round grade wide receiver at 54? Like, they don't know what to do.
Well, I mean, just looking at the top 2 tiers that we have, 13 of the teams in the NFL need a number 2 or better. And as we'll get into with the odds competition tier, there's a couple in there that I think potentially could even be an up a tier and then needs a number 2 section. Like legitimately half the league needs a high investment at wide receiver, whether that's through the free agent trade pool or whether that's through the draft.
Yeah, absolutely. So these last couple teams are, I would say, not less likely to add a number 2. They would just be less interesting from a fantasy perspective because A, we don't know who's playing quarterback for the Browns, Steelers, or Jets in 2025, but also too, like, we have some question marks about what the current number 1 receiver, quote unquote, is capable of doing there. With Jerry Jeudy, for example, I think he would be better served to be a number 2 receiver, but he is the de facto number 1 there right now. George Pickens and Garrett Wilson are both reportedly being available in trades, or maybe teams are just calling about them. We don't exactly know right now. These 3 teams, I wouldn't put it past them to take a receiver pretty high. Like, especially, I mean, Cleveland could just take Hunter at 2 and play him as a receiver predominantly. The Steelers could take a receiver at 21 and the Jets could take a receiver at 7. Like, it wouldn't shock me if we're talking about like my top 3 receivers, McMillan, Hunter, and Igbuka landing on these 3 teams.
Yeah, no, it can make a ton of sense. I mean, the other one I've seen reported as potentially a Matthew Golden to Pittsburgh. I've seen mocked a lot in based on the media, but I mean, yeah, it's hard to gauge with these 3 teams because you can argue the Browns need a number 1, but if they don't take Travis Hunter, what are their avenues of actually getting a number 1? Which is why they kind of land on this number 2 tier because I think it makes a ton more sense. I mean, first and foremost, again, it's either Travis Hunter or bust to add a number 1. But if you're at number 33, they should have the pick of the litter of the tier 2 wide receivers in this class. Like, assuming one of maybe Bird, Golden, et cetera, were to fall again. I doubt those guys are going to be on the board. But once you get down to like that, could Higgins be an option? Could Elike Manor be an option? Like, I think that's going to be starting the range. Sorry, of the tier 3 wide receivers. My apologies.
Yeah, I think it's possible Burden would be there for them at 33, but Jeudy and Burden, I mean, they're kind of similar-ish archetypes. I think if Burden develops, he could turn into a player like Jeudy as a route runner and as a playmaker there. So they're in a weird spot, man. I think Hunter actually just makes the most sense. It's just the question would be who is playing quarterback at that point. You take Hunter at number 2 overall, you're not getting Cam Ward, presumably, or Shedeur Sanders or whatever quarterback you'd be interested in. Does that mean now it's you take Travis Hunter, he's going to be your de facto number 1 receiver. That's where you're going to play him because Andrew Berry of the Browns did say that they prefer him as a wide receiver than they do as a cornerback. And they also have a good secondary already. So there's a chance that they would play him at wide receiver. And then, Jackson Dart in the 2nd round, sign Sam Darnold. Like, we don't exactly know what they would do at quarterback.
I'll say one thing and then we'll talk quickly on the Steelers Jets. For the Browns perspective, like, we're almost kind of hoping that they get sniped on Cam Ward because they're one of the few spots we know Travis Hunter would play wide receiver at, just for our own dynasty perspective.
Yeah, actually, I mean, from our perspective, we want Hunter to play wide receiver. So if there's a team that's openly saying they would play him at wide receiver, I think that's got to be one of his best landing spots because, there's teams out there that I'm sure would play him at cornerback, like Jacksonville, for example, probably plays him more at cornerback than they would at wide receiver.
Yeah, no, I would agree there. And then we'll just rapid fire with the Steelers and the Jets. I mean, the Steelers first, pretty obvious. Obviously, you have George Pickens as your big outside X wide receiver. Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson can kind of add that speed to the offense. But realistically, they just need a seasoned number 2 wide receiver that can separate at all 3 levels, which is why I understand the Matthew Golden fit, because if he were to fall at 21, he's a receiver that can separate at all three levels. So now you move Roman Wilson back a role, obviously Calvin Austin back a role. They can be your field stretchers. You have Pickens as your 50-50 guy. Now you have Golden that can separate at all three levels. I think that just makes the offense as a whole a lot more enticing.
Yeah, there's a couple reunitions that make reunitions. I don't know if that's the right word. Deontay Johnson maybe going back to Pittsburgh would make some sense. And
Amari Cooper, maybe.
Yeah, Amari Cooper would make some sense. Mike Williams was traded for them last season. He could be brought back as well. They're a double dip team, in my opinion. They would probably draft a receiver top 3 rounds and bring in Mike Williams or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think that would make sense. And then we'll just talk about the Jets really quickly. Obviously, it's pretty obvious if Garrett Wilson stays, he is the number 1 wide receiver there. Obviously, there are some trade rumors. I personally would be shocked if they traded Garrett Wilson. You already cut Aaron Rodgers. You already, or not cut Aaron Rodgers, sorry. You already cut Devontae Adams. Aaron Rodgers is reportedly on the way out next. Seemed like that was the biggest issue that Garrett Wilson had with the Jets when he made that trade request. And if they are both gone, why would Garrett Wilson now leave in a situation he is the clear de facto 1, especially when you consider the rest of their depth chart may be the worst in the league. We talked about the Patriots depth chart being up there, a couple of the other teams that we mentioned at the top. Outside of Garrett Wilson, the Jets' current wide receiver core is Allen Lazard for now, because he also apparently requested a trade, which, by the way, if anybody actually trades an asset for Allen Lazard, go get reevaluated. Xavier Gibson, Malachi Corley, Irvin Charles. They have Malik Taylor on the roster from last year, but he's an unrestricted free agent. Like, I don't know what to make of this team. They not only need a number 2 wide receiver, but they also need a number 3 and potentially a number 4.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd hope that Corley can at least be a 3 for you, given that you spent a third on him last year, and hopefully he can play like a big slot role for you. But yeah, they need help because like
bad.
Yeah,
they don't have a quarterback either.
Yeah, exactly. Wilson obviously you'd think would be happy that Rodgers is gone, but he still plays for the Jets. And like, if there's one thing the Jets know how to do, it's drive good talent out of their city. So it's possible that even if Rodgers and Adams are gone, that he still wants out and he wants to be traded. And that's why I think McMillan is definitely a potential fit for the Jets, because if they think that Garrett wants out or they actually trade Garrett or whatever, they could still go McMillan even if they don't trade Garrett. Like, it's possible that they take him at 7th overall or trade down and take him or whatever.
I think out of the teams in this tier, they have the worst depth chart by far.
Yeah, it's bad. It's bad for them. There's a lot of teams that need receivers, man, and there's not a lot of receivers available, which is why I think, we talked about, like, I think Godwin goes back to Tampa Bay, but like Adams, Diggs, Marquise, Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, even guys like on the lower end of things like Elijah Moore, Mike Williams, Deontay Johnson, KJ Osborne, Darius Slayton, DeAndre Hopkins. Like, I've heard De'Ami Brown getting some pub as like maybe he gets a 2-year, $25 million deal from a team or something like that. Like, it's going to be wild out there in the wide receiver streets, especially we'll know in free agency what the NFL thinks of this wide receiver draft class, because if they're throwing bags at De'Ami Brown, they must not think very highly of these dudes at all.
Hear me out. You know who's a Jet?
Who?
Brandon Cooks.
Yeah. Oh, that's disgusting. Or bring him back. Bring Mike Williams back potentially too. Oh God, what a disgusting mess. There's a bunch of teams in this next tier that could play spoiler to the teams above. Cause like, I wouldn't be shocked really if any of these teams invested heavily in the wide receiver position, specifically some of the bad teams in this tier, like the Giants, the Saints, and the Titans. Would it shock any of us if these guys spent up big at wide receiver, either in free agency or with a high draft pick? Like, I don't think it's at all out of the range of outcomes that the Saints don't take Ted McMillan as the first receiver off the board.
So we actually talked about this with the running back segment we did, but we know what the teams that are needing this position look like, but there's always teams every year that muddy it up. There's always a Seattle Seahawks grabbing Zach Charbonnet away from a running back needy team. There's always a Carolina Panthers sniping Jonathan Brooks from the Dallas Cowboys. There's always, every single year, an instance of a team in this tier ruining the chances of a team in the above tiers actually adding to their field or to their depth chart. And I think the Jaguars and the Giants specifically are the two that I actually wanted to add to the Needs number 2 wide receiver position, but we actually ended up settling at the ad competition portion. The reason being, I'll start with the Jaguars. You would look on face value and say, well, BTJ, Gabe Davis, Christian Kirk, Parker Washington, Josh Reynolds, all this wide receiver core overall on face level doesn't look bad. But when you contextualize that they have new management, James Gladstone comes in, Liam Cohn comes in as the new head coach, Liam Cohen has already been on record to say that he wants to build this offense around Brian Thomas Jr. There's already been reports that Christian Kirk's on the trade block. Evan Ingram's on the trade block. Gabe Davis is only last year on this deal. He signed a 3-year, $39 million deal last year. He has an out after 2025. The team theoretically could completely revamp this entire receiving core around Brian Thomas Jr. And that's actually what I think they're going to try to do. Now, this has been an underrated spot for this team in particular. But if somehow the Rams and the Jags came to a Kirk for Cooper Kupp type of deal, I think that would make a ton of sense.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't think Godwin gets to free agency, but I know Liam would be very interested in bringing him in too.
Like they are very fascinating to me because I think their investment level could literally be all across the board. They could either draft Ted McMillan at 5, draft a receiver at 5, or maybe at the very least trade down from 5, get some assets and draft a receiver, or they can draft a guy in the 4th round as a complementary piece. Like I have no clue where to gauge their investment level at wide receiver this year.
Yeah, they're definitely a team that we could have included in the tier above. We also, for what it's worth, like I had New Orleans and Tennessee, because if you just think of the definition of the tier above, needs a number 2. Who's the number 2 receiver in New Orleans right now? Who's the number 2 receiver in Tennessee right now behind Calvin Ridley? And you could even make the argument that Ridley isn't even that good of a number 1 to begin with. Like there is at least 15 NFL teams that could invest a top 2-round draft pick in a receiver or pay 15 plus million to a veteran receiver or be on the market for a T Higgins or a DK Metcalf or a Garrett Wilson or a Christian Kirk or a Cooper Kupp or a Brandon Ayuk in a trade.
We're at 19 of 32 NFL teams in those top 3 tiers. And again, we haven't even talked. I mean, we'll add depth with the Bears because obviously Keenan Allen is a UFA at this point, but 19 of the 32 need significant additions into their wide receiver core. But we're talking about this being a weak class.
Yeah, and like we both think there's merit to Jaden Higgins and Trey Harris and Alec Manor and Jalen Royals and even deeper down Jack Besh and some of the other guys, but like we don't know what the NFL is thinking. Like they might view some of those players as they're fringe day 2 guys. We think they're more kind of day 3 guys or whatever. We have no idea at this point in time. I tend to think they'll get pushed up the board because young receivers hitting on a 2nd or a 3rd round receiver is honestly, like we used to talk about back in the day, hitting on a rookie quarterback is one of the biggest advantages in the NFL. Dude, the amount of money that great wide receivers are making now, hitting on a 2nd and a 3rd round wide receiver puts you in a very, very high stratosphere of like Ladd McConkey or whatever. If he was up for a contract extension on the open market right now, yeah, he's making a crap ton of money on the open market. Someone will give him 30 to 35 million, I bet, on the open market. Like,
yeah, at the very minimum, 25 to 30 for sure.
Like you get a receiver like that on the open market, they're making a ridiculous amount of money. So if you hit on a 2nd or a 3rd round receiver, it is a huge benefit to the team that ends up doing it. So that's why I tend to think the receivers that were like, oh, is Jack Besh worth the 46th pick in the draft? Probably not, but it wouldn't shock me if he goes that high as a result of the need.
Because if you think about it, let's just say specifically the Giants with Malik Neighbors right now, the rookie deal he's on, how much is he making per year?
The Giants right now have the 26th highest investment into the wide receiver position. Malik Neighbors makes $6.6 million per deal or per year right now.
So if you're thinking about that, if he was available on the open market, knowing the market, how it works, let's say Jamar Chase gets his new extension this year, it's probably going to be in the $38 to $40 million range.
Neighbors makes what Chase makes. That's my opinion would be. If Neighbors was on the open market for any team to sign, the demand would push him up to what Chase makes.
And at the very minimum, you're getting a surplus of 30 million saved per year through at least 3 years. We'll just say after year 3, going into year 4, he ends up wanting to get his contract done at that point, which very well could be the case. We see a lot of young wide receivers eventually try to get their contract a year early. The very minimum, though, that's 3 years of a $30 million surplus that you would have had to pay him if he was available on the market.
Yeah, exactly. And potential, like, we're talking Chase making 40 million now. By the time Neighbors is up for his extension, who's to say he's not making 60,
45, 50? Yeah.
Like the way the cap goes up 35 every year, there's teams out there with $130 million in cap space, like the Patriots. They throw 50 million at a guy like Malik Neighbors if he was available. Like, what does it matter to them? They still have 70 million in cap space.
Especially with the cap going up. Yeah. These contracts that we're looking at right now within 2 years, like people are going to laugh at. I mean, just look at the quarterback position as a whole. Like obviously wide receiver, defensive end, cornerback, we can talk about their markets, but I mean, the quarterback market, we're talking about, is that an overpayment, 45 million 3 years ago? And now I mean, Brock Purdy's probably going to sign $55 million per this offseason.
Yeah, no, it's crazy when you look at like what Tua and Love and Lawrence got last year is going to start to look like a bargain a year and a half later. That's just how the position works. I think the smart franchises kind of recognize that they'll just pay your guys early, man. Like they'll be happy. You'll get that. Like the Eagles didn't have to wait till Devontae Smith said, "I want my money." They just paid him before he was even really up for his contract, and now he makes pretty much nothing relative to what the rest of the receiver position makes on the open market of his ability level.
For sure. So, I mean, a little tangent. We want to explain like the contract values, obviously, at the wide receiver position are going to be changing as we start to see some scarcity at the top with these top end wide receivers. If you can get the value on them from a contract standpoint early in the drafts, why would you not do that? I mean, we'll talk about the Buffalo Bills next. I think from a pure roster construction perspective, they're not too dissimilarly constructed to the Green Bay Packers. The difference, the Packers have been vocal about adding a wide receiver one.
Yeah, and the Bills, I would say, have some hope that they just paid Shakir a big contract. He's kind of their Jaden Reed, if we want to make that comparison. Coleman, I would say the Bills probably believe in more than anyone on the Packers roster with Watson's injury right now. So it's possible that they're like, hey, we think Coleman can be our number one receiver, but I do think they're going to add a player, whether it's bringing back Amari Cooper, another veteran free agent, maybe Devontae Adams would want to go there because he wants to try and win or something like that. That would make a lot of sense to me too, is just pay a 2-year, $50 million to Devontae Adams. I don't know if Diggs would be susceptible to coming back to the Bills. I don't think the Bills maybe even want Diggs back at this point in time, but I think they'll make an investment. It won't be nothing. It won't be huge, probably. Like I can't imagine the Bills back up.
Are they a Darius Slayton team?
Yeah, they could be like a Darius Slayton team. I don't think they would be the team that trades for T. Higgins or the team that trades for DK Metcalf or Brandon Ayuk or somebody like that.
No. I mean, if an edge rusher was available, that'd be another thing.
Yeah, for sure. But the Bills, I think, will add somebody, and they'll probably have value in rookie drafts specifically because I do tend to think that the Bills will add a rookie to this group. But maybe I think it would make a lot of sense for them to bring back Cooper or to sign Adams or something too.
Yeah, I was more so just making a joke about how much Bean loves his edge rushers. But anyways, we go to the Giants now. We mentioned the aforementioned Malik Neighbors, obviously wide receiver one. We can move on to the next position. Darius Slayton is an unrestricted free agent, as well as Amir Smith-Marset. And the rest of their wide receiver core, Wan'Dale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, Bryce Ford, Wheaton, Gunnar Olszewski. I think long-term, you probably view, obviously, Neighbors as your one, Wan'Dale potentially being your slot wide receiver. I think you need a true number two. They could bring back a guy like Darius Slayton, but realistically, I think I need a guy that has more of a target ceiling than that.
Yeah, Hyatt's got to be viewed as a 4 at this point in time. I think if you're the Giants, he's fast and he can do stuff, but like I think it's pretty clear he was overdrafted, and the NFL actually kind of agreed he shouldn't have gone as high as the media thought he should have gone, and he ended up going in the 3rd instead of like some people putting him into like early 2nd round or whatever. So they wouldn't shock me if they spent one of their high draft picks on a receiver and we're like, hey, we want, Neighbors going to be like our do-it-all number 1. We want maybe some size with our number 2 receiver. Again, I feel like we brought up Io Manor and Higgins and Trey Harris a million times, but those guys would make some sense, I think, to me to go to the Giants as like a number 2. And again, we have no idea what they're going to do at quarterback. Like if they bring in Aaron Rodgers, I think it's very likely they would sign Devontae Adams also, or even, I mean, maybe they're the team stupid enough to give a 7th round pickup for Allen Lazard on the open market because they want to make Aaron Rodgers happy. Like that's like the team in the same building as them didn't make that mistake already, but we'll see.
Yeah. Or maybe they just said, well, we just traded up to number 1 to get Cam Ward. We want to add a vet wide receiver that is maybe depressed on the market that has upside. Maybe they're the team that takes a swing at a guy like Amari Cooper. Yeah,
or they throw the bag at Diggs potentially too. Neighbors isn't making a whole lot of money and they have cap space. Like it wouldn't shock me if they're the team that throws the bag at Diggs.
For sure. And in terms of these last 3 teams, again, we do have no specific notes on them, but in terms of the Saints, obviously we expect Chris Olave to be the number 1 there long-term, but he's obviously had the concussion issues. We don't really know about the long-term future. Maybe they want some insurance there. Rashid Shaheed coming off a season-ending injury. I think they're almost a shoo-in to add some type of wide receiver. Again, we just don't know. Is that Ted McMillan at number 9 overall, or is that them drafting a Jalen Royals in round 3 to give some competition?
Yeah, I tend to think they'll probably go a little bit less of investment at than like Ted McMillan at 9th overall or whatever. They're pretty similar to me to the Titans, where they're kind of a bad team. They don't really have a whole lot figured out on offense in general, and they could add receiver because maybe they're just viewing whatever player on the board is the best player available. But they actually don't really know what they're doing at quarterback right now either. Like, it feels like Derek Carr is like, when someone like, someone's about to break up and they're still with their current person.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh yeah, like we're happy together or whatever. It's like, that's what Derek Carr and the Saints are right now. It's like, there's nobody better out there available right now. So they're just like, we'll just stay with you for another year.
Yeah, it's like when you're a kid and you want, the sprinkles and the Oreos and the Reese's on your ice cream, but they're like, hey, you know what? We got vanilla for you. And you try to put that happy face on, like, yeah, the vanilla's good, right?
Yeah, it'll give me sugar, and that's about it.
Yeah,
That's
there you
pretty
go.
much all we're at with it. I think the Titans is the one team I think we should probably even potentially move into the next tier, just because they
Yeah.
actually just need help at this position. Like objectively, they have under contract with Hopkins as a free agent. Somehow they're paying the sixth most money to the wide receiver position because Treylon Burks was a first rounder. He makes
NWI, baby.
He makes $4.5 million a year. Calvin Ridley's cap hit is $28 million, which again, we can argue whether or not that was a good contract. It probably wasn't a good contract. I still think Ridley's a good enough receiver that he can give you something, but they probably need a capable number two at the very least. They have the first pick in the draft. They're probably not going to take Travis Hunter with it. I wouldn't imagine. Maybe they will. Maybe they trade down and take Travis Hunter. They are probably likely to take a receiver in the second or the third round or sign a receiver in free agency. I think they're probably going to add somebody.
Dude, are they the favorite to pick number 1 overall next year again?
They're a
Genuinely.
bad franchise right now. And like if I were Tennessee, this is like a long-term rebuild. If you don't love Cam Ward, don't pick Cam Ward, man. Like just trade down, get the bag from the Giants or
Abdul
whoever's going to give you.
Carter.
Yeah, like get yourself prepared for Arch Manning, Nussmeier, whoever you like in next year's class, or even potentially into 2027's class if you're interested in that. Just build up your offense, build up your team, take a great edge rusher, take Travis Hunter, take whatever players you need to do, get your offensive line fixed. Hell, like, is it the worst thing in the world if you bring in an interesting stopgap free agent to compete with Will Levis and see what Levis has got for one more year? He makes no money. He has had, or maybe he doesn't have anymore, but he had upside when you drafted him. Let's see what happens. Like worst case scenario, you bench the guy in week 3 and you roll with Jameis Winston or whoever is your stopgap free agent addition for the rest of the year, and you stink and you draft a guy in 26.
Yeah, or we've talked about it. Apparently, the NFL teams are higher on this quarterback than we potentially are. But I mean, if you don't have a ton of receiving threats, you may as well just get the quarterback in the draft that's just going to run a lot with Jalen Milroe.
Yeah, or the veteran quarterback who never had receivers when he was a
Justin
starter,
Fields.
which is Daniel Jones.
Oh,
also,
fair.
Daniel Jones being the
Yeah.
next, Sam Darnold because he goes to the Titans and they draft a good receiver or something. Wouldn't shock me, man. Wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, facts. The Daniel Jones throwing to Calvin Ridley, Treylon Burks, NWI is exactly what I need on my television on Sundays.
That's the same as what Sam Darnold had in Minnesota. But yeah, no, there's interesting veteran guys. I think if I were Tennessee, just don't rush the process, man. Trust the process. Get a good player at number 1 or number 3 or number 2, wherever you end up picking if you trade down. Just get a great player. Worry about the rest later. Maybe give Will Levis and a veteran free agent a chance to prove themselves.
Yeah, and we do have to quickly talk about the Seahawks. The reason why they're here is obviously the DK Metcalf rumors. Like if they trade DK Metcalf, they would be up a tier into the needs number 2. But if they keep DK Metcalf, you can make the case that, oh yeah, they add somebody maybe to supplement the Tyler Lockett touches going forward. Because I don't know if Tyler Lockett's a free agent, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. There's been reports that they're not trying to bring him back at this point. I don't exactly know what's going on in that circumstance, but regardless, even if they don't even if they don't trade DK Metcalf and Lockett's gone, you need another receiver. But obviously, if DK Metcalf is gone, you're compounded up the list here.
Yeah, and I would bet everything I own that Lockett becomes a Raider as well. To go play with Russell Wilson and Pete Carroll, like guaranteed he would be a Raider in that situation. So yeah, these are the guys that we really needed to talk about at the top here. Again, there's guys in the next tier, adds depth. Ravens could add somebody behind Zay Flowers and Bateman. The Chiefs, because Kelsey is old and Worthy and is
Niners
young.
Are the most interesting here, in my opinion.
Niners are the most interesting because they could trade Ayuk still. And also Pearsall and Jennings. Jennings is, I believe, on a 1-year deal. Commanders would have been way higher, but they traded for Samuel. And I still think they could add some pieces to the receiver core. And De'Ami Brown apparently is going to get a bag in free agency. So we'll see what happens there. The Falcons, the Eagles, the Bears, all of those teams, interesting depth options because the Keenan Allen's a free agent. The Falcons don't really have much behind Drake London and Darnell Mooney. Eagles have Smith and AJ, but Jahan Dotson's their number 3. Like we'll see what ends up happening there.
Hey, this is an FSC classic, this guy. Get Elijah Moore to the Bears. That would be fun.
That would be fun, yeah. And then the Vikings, they're set at receiver for the most part. I mean, Osborne and Naylor, maybe you add depth there again. We're not going to worry about that too much. Lions probably set at receiver. Bengals franchise T. Higgins, I think they'll work out a deal with both guys. Dolphins have Malik Washington, who they drafted, and Tyreek and Waddle. They're probably fine. I firmly believe Godwin will be back in Tampa Bay. That's why they're in the safe tier. They have Evans, they have McMillan. And then the Colts, they have like 4 pretty good receivers right now with Pierce, Mitchell, Pittman, and Downs.
It's so weird with them because it's like you could make the case the Colts need a number one, but based off their investments and based off how many young players they have, they're probably best suited to just letting them grow with Anthony Richardson, hopefully this year.
Maybe just get a quarterback first before figuring this out. But yeah, let me just ask you this final question and we can get out of here. Of all of the teams in the higher tiers specifically, because they're the ones likely to invest in this position, who stands out to you as like, maybe they're like the biggest veteran sell? Like, so for example, we expect the Chargers to invest in a receiver. Does that make QJ a sell? Do we expect the Broncos to invest in a receiver? Does that make Sutton a sell? Do we expect the Raiders to invest in a receiver? That makes Myers a sell, something like that. Like, is there anybody that stands out here that like, they're probably overvalued on the market? Maybe you should sell them. I have one really strong answer here.
I mean, in terms of actual highly valued on the market, if I'm looking through, like obviously QJ, you can make the case for, it makes a ton of sense. Obviously, like the true number one wide receivers, like you're not worried about Nico Collins, you're not worried about CeeDee Lamb. I almost said Dak Prescott. He's on my head. You're not worried about Puka Nacua. And I'm assuming you're obviously not worried about Marvin Harrison Jr. We both expect him to take the step up. I would say out of the veteran options, funny enough, Pickens might be the one I'm most afraid of if they added like a Golden.
Yeah, he's a tough one because I think
low volume passing offense already.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would just be worried about buying him because he's kind of a knucklehead. To me, the answer is Jerry Jeudy is the one that's probably the best sell out of this list because he had such a great close to the season. They'll probably get a quarterback at some point, whether it's in free agency or the draft. I tend to think that they're going to be the aggressive team that gets Cam Ward, but we'll see what happens there. Jeudy had such a great season at the end of the year that he's like a top 36, top 40 dynasty receiver. And when most people are going to look at the depth chart and be like, there's nobody there, he's going to be the number one yet again. I just tend to think that Jerry Jeudy is the type of asset I roster in a lot of leagues. And when he's not playing well, it's impossible to get a damn thing for him on the market.
Yeah, I think with Jerry Jeudy, we've kind of learned across these last couple of years that any chance you have to liquidate him into a second round pick, you pretty much should, because there's been instances where you can't even get a third for him on the market.
Yeah, Jeudy is one of those guys that is very difficult to trade off of your team. If you're waiting for the production window, you got it this year for Jerry Jeudy, and he's got a good contract, so it's probably smart to get him off your team. Again, we covered pretty much everything from free agent wide receivers to teams that need wide receivers, everything in between at wide receiver in this video, a lot of draft stuff again. If you guys enjoyed, if you feel like you got some good value from this, leave a like, subscribe, check out the running back version of this video. We've broken down our draft stuff for the wide receiver position. If you want to check out the wide receiver prospect model, the part 2 of it was post combine. We also broke down wide receiver rankings, a little bit outdated at this point because we had some stuff change after the combine, but definitely to learn more about the draft class, you can definitely check those out. Draft guide edition 2 will be coming out middle of March, towards the end of March there. So definitely stay tuned for that. But with that being said, peace out and we'll talk to you soon.